The wind came down off the ridge that October morning carrying the smell of frost and turned wheat, and Sarah Whitfield was already awake to feel it slip through the gap beneath her kitchen door. She had been awake since before dawn, as she was most mornings now that the harvest was upon them, kneading bread dough with hands that had grown rough and capable over the 3 years since she'd taken over her father's farm. The old man had passed the winter before last, leaving her the house, the fields, and a debt to the bank that kept her awake some nights doing arithmetic in her head long after the lamp had burned low. She did not mind the work. What she minded, some mornings, was the silence of a house built for a family and now home to only her. She heard the wagon before she saw it, the particular creak of an axle that needed grease, and she wiped her hands on her apron and went to the window. A man was walking beside a horse that looked as tired as he did, leading it up the lane toward her gate, and behind him in the wagon bed sat 2 children wrapped in a quilt that had seen better decades. She recognized him after a moment. Thomas Bell, whose farm sat 6 miles east along the river bottom, a man she'd exchanged perhaps a dozen words with at church and at the mill, always polite, always in a hurry to get back to his fields. His wife had died of a fever the previous winter. Sarah had heard about it the way one heard about everything in a county this small, second-hand and softened by distance, and she had thought at the time how hard that must be, and then she had gone back to her own troubles because that was what people did. He stopped the horse at her gate and stood there a moment before he came through it, and she could see even from the porch that something had gone out of him. Some reserve of pride he'd been living on that had finally run dry. She came down the steps to meet him because it seemed wrong to make a man ask for whatever he'd come to ask standing in her yard like a beggar at a back door. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, and took his hat off, which struck her as an old-fashioned courtesy from a man who couldn't have been much past 30. "I wouldn't have come if I had another way. What's happened, Mr. Bell?" He looked back at the wagon, where the 2 children sat very still and very quiet in the way of children who have learned not to complain, and when he looked back at her his jaw was working like he was chewing on words too big to swallow whole. "The bank's called in what I owe. I lost the harvest to hail 3 weeks back, most of it, and what's left won't cover the note, and I've got nothing in that house to feed my babies with. Nothing but half a sack of cornmeal and some dried apples." He stopped, and she watched him decide whether to say the rest, and then say it anyway because there was no more room for pride in him. "Please, feed my children. I'll work for it. I'll work until my hands bleed, but I can't watch them go hungry another night." Sarah stood there in her own dooryard with the smell of bread still on her hands and felt something crack open in her chest that she hadn't known was sealed shut. She thought of her own father, and how he'd have answered a man who came to him like this, and she thought that she already knew the answer before she'd finished thinking the question. "Bring them in," she said. "Bring them both in, and put the horse in the barn. There's hay enough. You'll all eat supper here tonight, and we'll talk after about the rest of it." The boy was called Daniel and was 7, with his father's dark hair and a wariness in his eyes that no child that age should carry. The girl was named Ruth, not yet 5, and she clung to her brother's hand the whole walk up to the house as though the ground itself might give way beneath her. Sarah set them at her table and put bread and butter and a thick vegetable stew in front of them, and she watched, trying not to watch too obviously, as the boy ate slowly, deliberately, glancing at his sister's bowl as though prepared to give up his own portion if hers ran short. It was the look of a child who had learned to ration hope itself, and it undid something in Sarah more thoroughly than any speech Thomas Bell could have given her. After the children had eaten their fill and fallen asleep by the fire, wrapped in quilts Sarah brought down from the cedar chest, she and Thomas sat at the table with cups of coffee going cold between them, and he told her the whole of it. The wife he'd loved and lost. The hailstorm that had flattened his corn 2 weeks before it was ready to bring in. The note at the bank that had seemed manageable when his wife was alive to help him keep the books and manage the household on what little they had, and that had become an impossible weight once he was trying to be father and farmer and mourner all at once, sleeping 4 hours a night and still falling behind. He did not ask for pity and she did not offer it, because she understood, in the particular way that only someone who has run a farm alone can understand, that pity was worse than useless to a person in his position. What he needed was a plan. "I've got more land than I can work alone," she said finally, And you've got hands and a strong back and no crop left standing. My father always said a farm needed at least 2 sets of eyes on it to be run right, and I've been trying to prove him wrong for 3 years and mostly failing." She said it lightly, but she meant every word. "There's a tenant house on the north edge of my property, hasn't been lived in since my uncle passed. It wants some fixing, but it's sound. You and the children could winter there. You'd work my land alongside me, we'd split what we bring in come spring, and it buys you time to sort things out with the bank without your children going hungry in the meanwhile." Thomas Bell looked at her for a long moment, and she watched pride and desperation and something like disbelief cross his face in quick succession, and then he said, in a voice rough with more than exhaustion, "I don't know how to thank a kindness like that." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Wait till you've spent a winter chopping wood for me. You may curse my name by January." He almost smiled at that, the first easing she'd seen in his face since he'd come through her gate, and something passed between them in that moment that neither of them named but both of them recognized. The particular understanding of 2 people who have each been carrying more than their share of weight, finding out all at once that the weight might be lighter split in 2. The tenant house took the better part of 2 weeks to make livable, and Sarah found herself over there most afternoons once her own chores were done, helping Thomas patch the roof and chink the gaps in the walls and scrub decades of dust from the floorboards, while Daniel and Ruth trailed after them carrying tools too big for their hands and asking questions that made the work go slower and, somehow, easier. She had forgotten what it was to have voices in a house, to have small feet running across floorboards, to have someone underfoot asking why the sky was blue or why chickens couldn't fly, and she found that she had missed it more than she'd let herself know. Winter came on hard that year, the way it did in that country, and there were weeks when the drifts against the barn stood taller than Daniel, and the wind screamed down off the mountains loud enough to wake the whole household in the night. But there was wood enough because Thomas cut it before the snow came, and there was food enough because Sarah's cellar was well stocked from her own harvest, and because Thomas, true to his word, worked every hour daylight allowed and several that it didn't, mending fences and repairing tools and doing the 100 small tasks that a farm demanded and that Sarah had been too short-handed to keep up with on her own. In the evenings, when the work was done, the 2 households had taken to sharing supper together in Sarah's kitchen, because it seemed foolish for 2 fires to be burning and 2 pots to be cooking when one of each would do just as well and the company was better besides. Ruth had taken to calling her Miss Sarah, and then by December simply Sarah, with the easy affection of a child who has decided someone belongs to her. Daniel took longer to warm, as boys who have watched a parent grieve often do, but by the time the first hard freeze came he had stopped flinching when Sarah reached out to help him with his coat, and had started, without seeming to notice he was doing it, seeking her out to show her things, a bird's nest fallen from a tree, a drawing he'd made, a word he'd learned to spell. There is no single moment in a story like this one where 2 people fall in love, no lightning strike of recognition that a novelist might invent for the sake of drama. It happens instead in 100 small moments strung together like beads on a wire, in the way Thomas began, without being asked, to fix the things around Sarah's house that had needed fixing since her father died and that she had simply learned to live around. In the way Sarah began setting an extra place at her table without having to think about it, the way a person sets a place for someone who belongs there. In the long evenings after the children were asleep, when Thomas and Sarah sat by the fire going over the farm's accounts together, 2 heads bent over the same ledger, and found that the work went easier, and the silences between them grew comfortable rather than awkward, and neither one was in any particular hurry to say good night. It was February when Thomas finally said what had been sitting unspoken between them for weeks, on a night when the children were long asleep and the fire had burned down to embers and neither of them had made a move to bank it for the night. "I came to your gate in October a broken man," he said, "and I asked you for nothing more than food for my children, because that was as far as I could see past my own trouble. I didn't come looking for what I found here. I want you to know that. I didn't come here hoping for a wife, or hoping my children would find a mother in you, though God knows they have, in every way that matters. I came here desperate, and you gave me more than I had the right to ask for. And somewhere between October and now I stopped thinking of it as charity and started thinking of it as home. I love you, Sarah Whitfield. I've loved you for longer than I've let myself admit, and I don't know what a woman like you wants with a man who came to her with nothing but 2 hungry children and a wagon that needed greasing, but I'm asking anyway, because I think I'd rather ask and be refused than spend the rest of my life wondering." Sarah did not answer him right away, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to hold the moment a little longer before it passed into memory, the way a person holds a full breath before letting it go. She had spent 3 years telling herself that the farm was enough, that independence was its own reward, that she did not need a household full of voices to feel her life was complete. She understood now, sitting across the dying fire from a man whose hands bore the calluses of the same work as her own, that she had been telling herself a story that was only half true, and that the other half of the truth had walked through her gate on an October morning wearing a hat he'd taken off out of respect for a stranger, begging not for himself but for his children. "I think," she said finally, "that a farm needs 2 sets of eyes on it to be run right. And I think a house needs more than eyes. It needs voices in it, and feet running across the floor, and someone to share the ledger with of an evening. I've had those things in my house since October, Thomas Bell, and I find I don't want to give them up." She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, work-worn as her own. "Yes. My answer is yes." They were married in April, in the small white church that served the whole valley, with Daniel standing solemn and proud beside his father and Ruth scattering the first wildflowers of the season down the aisle with a fierce concentration of a child who has been given an important job and means to do it right. The tenant house stood empty after that, its purpose served, and the whole family moved into the farmhouse that had once held only Sarah and her memories and now held 4 people and, within 2 years, a 5th, a daughter they named Grace, born in the depth of another hard winter, but into a house that had food enough and warmth enough and love enough for anyone who came through its door in need. The farm prospered in the years that followed, not because fortune had suddenly turned kind, but because 2 people working a piece of land together could accomplish what one struggling alone could not, and because a debt of gratitude repaid with steady labor and steadier love had built something sturdier than either of them could have built on their own. Thomas paid off what remained of his old debt within 3 years, using earnings from the joint harvest, and though he never spoke of that October morning as anything but the worst day of his life, he came, in time, to understand it as the day that had led him to the best years of it. Sarah, for her part, would sometimes stand at her kitchen window on autumn mornings when the frost lay heavy on the turned wheat, and think of the young widower who had walked up her lane leading a tired horse, and marvel at how a single act of kindness, given without any thought of what it might return, had grown into an entire harvest of a life she had not known to hope for. Daniel grew into a young man as steady and capable as his father, and stayed on the land his whole life, eventually taking over the running of the farm himself with a wife of his own and children who called Sarah grandmother, with the same easy affection Ruth had shown her as a girl. Ruth grew up gentle and generous, remembering little of the hunger of that hard year but carrying always, without quite knowing where it came from, a habit of setting an extra place at any table she ever kept, in case someone should come to the door in need of a meal and a kindness. And when Ruth herself was grown, and asked once by her own daughter why she always cooked more than the family could eat, she told the story her father had told her, of the morning he had walked up a stranger's lane with nothing left but 2 hungry children and a broken kind of pride, and had begged a woman he barely knew to feed them, and had been given, in return for that single desperate plea, an entire harvest of years he had never dared to hope for. The story was told and retold at that family's table for generations after, not as a tale of tragedy averted, but as a lesson passed down like a well-worn tool, that the smallest kindness, offered without calculation to a stranger at the gate, might turn out to be the seed of an entire life's harvest, growing quietly for years before anyone thinks to count what it has yielded.